Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. So I give lots of talks, and today's the first time I've ever had makeup put on me. So thank you, Hugh. My 5-year-old daughter will be very jealous. She's been asking for that for a very long time for me. So tomorrow morning when she wakes up, I'll tell her I wore makeup yesterday. I love talking about anxiety disorders for a lot of reasons, and I love my work working with these kids with anxiety disorders for many reasons, but one of those is that they're very treatable, that these disorders, while they're chronic and impairing and can be really disabling in some cases, in almost every case they are treatable with the right kinds of treatment. So I want to talk to you today about a lot of the actually very counterintuitive things that we can do to help kids living with anxiety disorders. I love my talks to be somewhat conversational. I know we're going to have a question and answer at the end of this, but please feel free if something is really on your mind. It's probably not only on your mind. We can't have it be really slow going through a lot of questions, but if you really want something clarified or you have a comment, please stop me. I don't pretend to have a monopoly of information on how to help kids with anxiety disorders, and you guys are all experts in your own children, so I'd love to hear from you guys as well. Hopefully this works. Yes. Okay, so why this is so important. As you can see up here, this is what really, when I talk to parents, this really strikes them, that we know that half of all kids who at some point during their lives will meet the criteria for at least one anxiety disorder do so prior to the age of 11 years. Okay, that's the median age. So half of all people are going to meet the criteria before the age of 11. So we're seeing that this is by far the earliest age of onset of any category of mental health disorders in our big book of disorders that we talk about so much. In addition, just between the ages of 13 and 18, today in this very moment, 8% of those kids are going to meet the criteria for at least one anxiety disorder. So this is a really common problem that begins early and affects a lot of people. More than that, though, if we look at the number of people that it will have the disorder, or one of the disorders, I should say, between the ages of 13 and 18, the new research jumps up to 31.9%. And that's across both genders. And so if we think about that, what that means is basically 1/3 of all kids are going to have an anxiety disorder, at least one prior to their 18th birthday. So this is a really, really significant problem that affects a huge number of kids who are tragically underserved in their suffering. Of those kids, we look at the fact that almost 9% are going to have a severe anxiety disorder, which greatly impacts their lives. These are the kids I love working with, the kids that can't go to school or can't play in a sport or can't function day by day because their anxiety is literally disabling for them. And so really we can see this is something that affects a great number of families, not just the kids. It affects siblings of these kids. It obviously affects their parents. I hear from many parents that trying to parent a kid who has a severe anxiety disorder is exhausting and relentless. And those of you who are living with that understand what that means, because you never know each morning how it's going to be when the kid's off to school. You're going to get a phone call, or you're going to get the kid into school, or are they going to go to their karate practice that evening because they're too afraid to go. So what we can see here is that this is a very significant problem, but tragically, and this is the great tragedy, and one of the reasons why I give so many of these talks, is that only 18% of all of these kids receive any treatment whatsoever. And that's compared to ADHD, which is almost 80%. 79% of kids with ADHD get treatment for their disorder, compared to only 18% when it comes to anxiety disorders. To compound that tragedy, what we look for and what we realize is true, and this is, again, hard for me to even say, is that among the clinicians in the country who work with kids from a mental health standpoint, only about 12% of them are trained in the proper techniques to treat these kids, called exposure therapy. And so tragically, if kids aren't given the right kind of treatment, then they will not get better by and large. And worse than that, they will believe that they cannot get better because they've seen somebody who didn't give them a treatment that works. And they don't know that. They think that they don't work. And it's a really important distinction. So that's, again, one of the reasons I love giving these talks, is to educate people about the wonderful treatments that do exist and how to locate those services. The story even gets worse for girls. Okay, 38% of girls are going to have an anxiety disorder between the ages of 13 and 18, compared to only about 26% of boys. For adults, for every man who has an anxiety disorder, 1.7 women also do. Right? It's the one time the gender disparity works in that direction, right, and not the other way. And so what we're seeing is that this is something that we have to be aware of. I was talking at an all-girls school just yesterday, training their staff, and talking about the unique challenges that girls experience when they experience anxiety. But thankfully, they're more likely to actually talk about their anxiety and to seek out services for them. But when we're talking about girls, we talk a lot about the other kinds of disorders during the high school years, but look at the difference there, that 4.2%, is that the air conditioning? Okay. So 4.2% of girls are going to have ADHD. 10.2 will have a substance abuse disorder, and 3.8 will have an eating disorder. Those are really important, sometimes life-threatening conditions that need our attention. But look at those numbers compared to 38%. It's an exponentially more significant problem dealing with these anxieties, an order of magnitude difference in terms of the frequency and prevalence of these disorders. I know a lot of you are parents here at the lab school, which I have great respect for, and the work that they do here consistently for kids who learn differently. But those kids are obviously at an increased risk for developing anxiety disorders. It's anecdotally from my practice, and I treat almost exclusively kids with anxiety disorders, I would say at least half, probably more than that, have at least one learning difference. And it's interesting, I spent some time looking up some of the research and trying to figure out what are the exact prevalence rates with learning differences and with anxiety disorders, and the research is overwhelmingly focused on ADHD. And so if you look it up, you will find pages and pages of comorbidity data, which means co-occurring conditions between ADHD and anxiety disorders, but very few looking at disorders of written expression, processing speed disorders, reading disorders, things of that nature. And I can't tell you how often in my practice I see kids who have social anxiety disorder, have a hard time going to school, and have a processing speed disorder. Because obviously processing speed doesn't just affect what you're doing in a classroom. If you're in a group conversation and you can't process the information quickly enough to be able to then join in the conversation before it moves on, then you're going to be nervous about being in that situation. And so I'm seeing more and more of the processing speed disorders in my practice, and I couldn't find very much research on that when I looked it up online. But what I did find is the estimates actually vary widely, that between 20 and 40% of kids who have learning differences are also going to suffer from an anxiety disorder. And I think it's actually probably a lot higher than that, at least than the kids that I work with. Now, thankfully, at a school like the lab school, they're being educated in a way where they can learn. I have many, many kids who are at mainstream schools who are very smart, IQs in the 130s, but they are reading at a third grade level. And they don't want to use accommodations because they have an anxiety disorder about being noticed. And so they're in that situation. The parents can afford a private education for them, and they are trailing off. As we know that only 16% of high school kids who have an LD ever get a high school diploma. And so I think part of that isn't just the frustration intolerance. I think a large part of that is the fact that there's the anxiety about being in a situation where I could be judged or evaluated by my peers or by my teachers. And so I think that we vastly underestimate that because a lot of kids don't have the words to describe what they have, what they're experiencing, or they might confuse frustration with anxiety because they're clustered together in some important way. So while this is what the research shows, my anecdotal stories of that is that this is a very strong underestimate of the number of kids actually going through the co-occurrence of an LD and an anxiety disorder. When we look at the stress that kids go through, there was a great research study published by the APA a few years ago. It's called Stress in America. And this is the first time they ever included kids in the survey. And they were looking at where do they experience the most amount of their stress from. And they went through and they asked all these questions. And not surprisingly, the biggest number was doing well in school. I was giving a talk at Sidwell just a couple weeks ago, and 10% of their kids went to Yale last year. And talk about implied pressure in terms of what kids go through in those environments. I was at the Potomac School just last week. The same deal there, that there is this implied pressure, expectation from families who are successful and are achievement-oriented that they should do the same. And a lot of these kids will swear they put it on themselves because they can't understand the context of their own anxiety. So this makes sense. A third have stress about family finances. But what was striking about this study wasn't these rates. It was how divergent they were with their parents' expectations of how stressed they thought their kids were. In many of these instances, the kids were double the rate that their parents thought they would be. And so when I give a talk, I was giving a talk, I said at the Potomac School, and I mentioned that survey, I said, kids, you're actually right. Your parents don't fully understand how much stress you're under, statistically speaking, and they cheered. Because I said, yeah, that's absolutely true. They don't get it because school is different for many kids now than it was when we were in school. And if you're not in a school that gets it and understands how to meet these kids' needs, they're going to have a huge amount of anxiety, which is why I'm a very busy person these days. Now, I wish that depression stopped on your 18th birthday, but we know that it doesn't. And it continues to be the most common category of mental health disorders throughout the lifespan. So what that means is that about 28%, 29% if you add it up, is going to meet the criteria, again, for at least one anxiety disorder, and many people who have one have more than one. And so what that means is that these are age 18 ongoing, that right now, 18% have a disorder. Almost 1 in 5 of you have an anxiety disorder right now, which translates into 40 million American adults. So let's think about that number for a minute and how that impacts families, how it impacts jobs and careers and students if they're teachers. You know, this is something that really affects a great number of people. So again, where you're seeing the chronicity of this, the high prevalence of this, and how impairing it can be for these kids, and that is the bad news. And I begin with that because I want to get your attention about how important this issue truly is. Here's the good news. That treatment works, and it works well, and it often works very quickly. So I love that quote that I found online saying that ultimately we know deeply that on the other side of every fear is freedom. Because that's what it is when you have an anxiety. It's someone telling you you can't do something. It's having a heckler with you all the time saying, don't do that, it could end badly. And so when you get escaped from that, when you're able then to make choices based on preference and not fear, that is freedom. And so what we're seeing here is that the treatment success rates for the different anxiety disorders range from between 60 to 90%. That's huge. And this, by the way, are not just kids who showed improvement. These are kids who no longer met the diagnosis at discharge, that were now in the normal range of anxiety. There's another whole front that's just emerging now that we can take kids who are at risk for anxiety because we know their parents have an anxiety disorder. And if we do an intervention called primary prevention before they begin showing symptoms, we can do an amazing job of stopping them from ever developing the anxiety disorder. So that's the new front, is how do we catch these kids before they become symptomatic? How do we arm them with skills and techniques they can use, intertwined hopefully with a curriculum at some point, so the kids can learn these things before their symptoms begin to appear, because 1 in 3 of them are going to have it before they're 18. And we think about all the sex ed that we give and all the health education we give, and what a small portion of that is actually armed on specific techniques for mental health. And it's a really important concept. And again, while it's very successful, and it's really fun to do, by the way, I have the best job in the world. I'll tell you later on about some of the work that I do, because it means going on offense against the fear, and it means kind of doing things with the kids that they are afraid of, and it can be hilarious sometimes and really fun. And I try and make it fun or the kids won't ever come back. And that's true. And that, again, the tragically low utilization rates. We have these wonderful treatments that work, and only a small fraction of the kids who need the services ever get the services because they don't know that it's available, they don't know how to advocate for themselves, or they go to a person who does not use evidence-based treatment. Okay, yes?
Does that affect long-term?
Great. So the question was, does that affect long-term? I can quote one study for you with social phobia, for instance, that we looked at doing a combined treatment of exposure-based therapy and social skills training. And we found that at the discharge date, the number was here. At 3 months, it was here. At 6 months, it was here. And at 3 years, it was down here. So they were getting better over the course of the 3 years following termination, and 79% of those kids maintained their progress at 3 years, which is the last time they've actually taken the data on it. So yes, we are arming them with very specific skills, an owner's manual for their nervous system, and it can be then adapted for different kinds of anxiety. Now, it is true that we'll often see a whack-a-mole situation, that we'll have a kid who is at an early age having separation anxiety at kindergarten, and then it might move into weather fears when they're in 2nd grade, and it might morph into social phobia when they're 13. Those kinds of things are very typical of what we work with, but if we can arm them with very specific skills, the research does show it has a generalization effect. That's a great question. But some other things about anxiety. Anxiety is not a disorder. Anxiety can become disordered, like any other part of your body can, but anxiety is chosen by evolution very carefully as a primary way to keep us safe. In the same way physical pain is there. We would think that life would be great if we didn't have pain or anxiety, but it wouldn't, because we would do dumb things, we would do dangerous things. When we are anxious, we don't want to repeat that mistake in the future. Okay? Evolution has taught us that anything that makes us sick, hurt, or scared, we don't want to do again. And that's a good thing. You know, how many of you have ever gotten food poisoning and can never look at that food ever again, right? For me, it's 7-layer bean dip from Costco. I can't even go down that aisle anymore. It was a really, really bad night. And so that fear and that avoidance will last in perpetuity, right? Because when something makes us very scared or hurt, we don't want to have to repeat that mistake over and over again to catch on. We want what's called one-trial learning. And so it's very easy for kids to acquire anxiety in a given situation. And if the danger is real, then it's an appropriate anxiety. It's an alarm that goes off when it's supposed to. And it's a response to real danger. It's accurate. And again, it keeps us safe in the future from not making that mistake again. What disordered anxiety is when it leads to functional impairment, when it stops kids from doing things that are not dangerous that they would otherwise like to do, but the anxiety is too high of a wall to climb over. And so think of it like a really annoying false alarm that goes off all the time. But here's the funny thing about it is if you, in the morning, are getting dressed and you put the toast in the toaster, go upstairs to finish getting dressed, and the smoke alarm in your kitchen goes off, you can never tell by the sound of the alarm if you burnt your toast or the curtains are on fire. It's going to sound exactly the same. So you can't judge the intensity, you can't judge the reality of the danger based on the intensity of your fear. It's the same phenomenon. The experience is identical, whether or not the danger is real. And that's something that kids often, and adults too, make a mistake about. They think that it must be dangerous because I am so anxious in this situation, when in fact we know the two are not correlated when you have an anxiety disorder. And that's why, in terms of prognosis, when kids walk in, the research shows us it doesn't matter so much how bad the anxiety is when you walk in the door. It matters how badly you want to get rid of it. The motivation for change is a much better predictor than severity of symptoms are, because it takes hard work. You know, when I'm with these kids, I often say it's like me being a personal trainer. I can show you how to use the equipment. I can be with you when you do it, but you're the one doing the heavy lifting. And if you're only lifting things that are really light, it's easier, but you won't get any stronger. And it's exactly the same process when we're going on offense against the anxiety by doing this exposure therapy that I'm so committed to. Okay. Any questions or comments from anybody so far? The question was that at what age does exposure therapy tend to be effective? How young can you bring them? At 3 or 4? You know, 6 months? Actually, habituation can be measured when kids are in infancy. And so what happens is that our magic trick is that we turn fear into boredom by doing things often enough or long enough. So we do see kids who are 3 who won't talk in preschool because they're socially anxious. They don't know they're socially anxious. They just know they won't talk in those situations. So using reinforcement and prizes and a lot of parent training, we can get them to slowly begin to make sounds in front of us, and we generalize it to other environments. So exposure therapy knows no age bounds. I do it with people who are very elderly as well. Okay, great question. So when I work with these kids, and this is part of the reason why I love what I do so much, is that, and I firmly believe this, that if you have a kid who is smart, creative, and compassionate, the universe will go ahead and throw anxiety in for free. Right? It's a package deal. Every virtue casts a shadow, and the shadow of those virtues is anxiety. And if you realize that's a great winning hand, right? That's a great package deal because the anxiety is treatable, and when we get rid of that, then we are left with the virtues remaining. And that's a really important concept for the kids to understand. So I always joke with the kids and I'll say, if you won a door prize and they told you you could have this brand new Corolla or this brand new Ferrari, and both are free, but if you choose the Ferrari, you will need some special classes to know how to drive it appropriately. Which would you choose? Right? Everybody would choose the Ferrari, I hope, even if it meant extra classes to learn how to use it. And that's what we do, is that when we're in therapy, we are basically doing the owner's manual review with these kids, teaching them how to master their own nervous systems about what the anxiety is, but more importantly, what the anxiety is not, which is important. What it is, it's temporary and harmless. But as I tell all of the kids, avoidance ruins lives. Okay, but it really is a package deal, and these kids are wonderful kids who almost always are from great families who care deeply about their kids and their situations, but they don't know how to modulate their own response in those circumstances. So let's talk about where kind of the pillars of anxiety. And these aren't, you won't, if you Google these, you won't find them. I made this up. But uncertainty, I think of anxiety as an allergic reaction to uncertainty. Uncertainty is the foundation of all fear. Who among us, when we were young kids, had a fear of something living under our bed, right? You wouldn't want your arm to dangle off the bed at night. Who envisioned a really sweet, fluffy rabbit that was your best friend, right? Nobody. Your mind goes to the scary things. When we are faced with uncertainty, we have a bias towards anxiety, we will assume that it's going to be a really scary situation, and uncertainty makes us feel very uncomfortable in most circumstances. Lack of control is the flip side of that coin, that we want to have control over our situations, we want to have control over our experience. The reality is, at best, we can hope for influence, but never control. Trying to gain certainty, trying to gain control is like trying to grab a handful of smoke. You can see it, but you can never get it. As soon as you think you have it, you look in your hand and it's gone. And you try and get it again, and you get it again, and you get it again. And the entire time you spend trying to grab a handful of that smoke rather than living your life. And so it's really important to understand that the quest for certainty and the quest for control are very natural, normal drives in people. But when it comes to situations that involve anxiety, it's a fool's errand, and it will actually increase your suffering over time. When I talk to kids, we talk a lot about tolerating uncertainty. I will give them this example. I'll say, I'm going to choose a number between 1 and 1,000. And I want you to think about it as long as you need to before you know the right answer. And they'll often say, well, I don't understand the question. I'll say, that's the point, is that if you give me an answer right now, or you give me an answer a week from now after hours and hours of contemplation, you are no closer to the right answer because it's unknowable. And so when you're trying to gain the answer, you are actually not getting closer to it. So we need to tolerate the uncertainty, allow it to be present in our lives, and that intolerance of uncertainty is one of the great foundations of any kind of an anxiety disorder. Okay. And of course, the perception of threat is there, and the perception is the really important part of it because a threat perceived is a threat achieved, to borrow from international relations. It comes down to the appraisal process itself. That when we are anxious, if we are looking towards something and recognizing it as a threat, we will then perceive it as a threat. And when we are hypervigilant for threat cues, we will notice them all the time. Remember those of you who were around during that awful time of the snipers? Remember how there were white box trucks everywhere? Right? Wherever you looked, there was a white box truck, and we were all thinking, where are they coming from? Who was punking us by sending all these white box trucks in? And the reality was that we suddenly recognized a neutral stimulus as being a threat cue, which means that we were prioritized to look for it, and we noticed it like someone saying our name across a crowded room. We were tuned to that frequency, and so therefore we overestimated the danger. Okay. So how do we acquire anxiety? Well, there's 3 ways that we do it, and those of you who've had Psych 101 will recognize some of these terms here. Classical conditioning is simply paired association. So if I say to you a word, I want you to think of the next word that comes into your head. Okay? Peanut butter. Okay, what did you guys come up with? Jelly, right? How'd you do that? Did you mean to? How do you, if someone said to you, how'd you think of jelly? Do you have any idea how it got there? I mean, you know it popped in your head, you're aware of that, but you don't really know the process that unfolded to produce that word coming in your consciousness. When I talk to kids and I say, you know, why can't you go to school, or why is this so hard to be in this situation, the number one answer I get is, I don't know, but I just know it's really hard and I don't want to do it. Because it's often classically conditioned, and out of their conscious awareness, it's simply a cued response. And just like the peanut butter and jelly example, they don't know how it happens, they just know it's there. It's a really important concept. The other one is modeling. We as humans are designed to learn through observation. We're one of the only species that has whites in our eyes. And one of the theories behind that is so we can tell where our peers are looking. So then we can notice the danger that might be out there. We can see where people are looking and look in that same direction. And what that means is that if we're watching other people that we respect act in an anxious way, it's contagious. Especially if it's a parent acting in that way. Because remember when we were kids how all-powerful our parents seemed? It wasn't even like they were humans. It was like they were a different species until you turned 15 and they knew nothing anymore. And so what happens is that if a parent is acting in an anxious way, like say the Bay Bridge, and then a kid watches mom or dad have a hard time going over the Bay Bridge, how scary must that Bay Bridge be if mom or dad is afraid to drive over it? And so modeling is a very, very typical way for how this happens. And that's why, one of the reasons that when a parent has an anxiety disorder, their kids are at a much more elevated risk for also having an anxiety disorder. The last one there is information transfer. So back in the caveman days, something happened to your best friend Gunther. That was really important information for you to know. It would directly affect your situation and your safety. But now, we have access to every part of the planet almost instantaneously. We can cull through 6.5 billion people's data, and we can then hear about one scary thing that happened, like a shark attack off Cape Town. And then suddenly I don't want to go into the water in Ocean City because there could be a shark there. And kids don't understand probabilities. Kids do not understand how to not confuse fear and probability. You know, I had a kid years ago who was very afraid of tornadoes, and by very afraid, he was 15. I mean that he would stay in the bathtub and not go to school on cloudy days afraid of tornadoes. And he had survived one at a very early age. And so I couldn't tell him that they don't happen because he lived through one of them. So I asked the kid, I said, so what do you think that the chances are of you being in a tornado, like being killed? And he said, I don't know, 1 in 1,000. I said, how many kids go to your school? He said, 2,000. So you're losing 2 kids a day from your high school? They should move that school. That's a dangerous place to be. He said, no, that's wrong. Maybe it's like, I don't know, 1 in 10,000. But still, you're losing 1 kid a week to tornadoes. Like, that's a really dangerous place. They should really do something about that. And he said, well, maybe I got that wrong. You know, maybe it's not 1 in 10,000. So we actually did the math out. We went on the actuary tables for 50 years in Maryland. And we did the math, a population size over 50 years times 365. And the chances of being killed in Maryland by a tornado was about 1 in 6 billion. There were 2 fatalities in those 50 years in the entire state. And so he had vastly overestimated that risk because the information was out there. I mean, he had the personal experience, but even without that, you can watch the Storm Chasers on Discovery Channel. You can go through all these different situations where you're understanding that these things happen, and when you're young, you don't have the context to better understand that. Yes?
So are you saying that anxiety is a learned behavior?
It certainly can. The question is anxiety a learned behavior? It certainly can be. And it can be reinforced with attention and with other things I'll get to in a few minutes, because anxiety is a dual-way street, which means that we're constantly observing our body as well as our mind. And if our body is acting in an anxious way, we will then increase our own anxiety in that circumstance. So yes, in fact, you're looking at the classic examples of little Albert back at the turn of the century in 1900 about how do kids learn to be anxious. They gave this poor toddler a white rat, and they said, all right, let's see how people get afraid of rats. And little Albert thought it was the coolest thing in the world. He'd pet the rat and thought it was a great thing. I thought, well, how do we get him afraid of the rat? They tried some different things. What worked was they snuck up behind poor little Albert and they banged pans together when he pet the white rat. And he cried and screamed, as you can imagine a toddler doing. And guess what? At that point, he was terrified of white anything. Not just white rats, white rabbits, white lab coats, all kinds of things. He generalized the fear very quickly. And so yes, anxiety can and is often learned in those experiences. Okay, one of the biggest things that people need to understand is that anxiety is not our enemy. Anxiety, as I mentioned before, is 2 things. Anxiety is temporary and harmless, but avoidance can ruin lives. So fear and avoidance are teammates. They work on the same side, and that if we can cut off the avoidant coping, then the anxiety will die a natural death. And anxiety comes in lots of different flavors. It's not just not wanting to go on the elevator. It can be not wanting to think about something that makes you anxious, or trying to avoid the affective, visceral experience of emotions. I see a lot of kids who skate over a frozen lake of emotions until they can't, until they reach a crack and they fall in and get totally overwhelmed by it. So avoidance is really the thing that we care the most about, and the thing that treatment is designed to do is to decrease the avoidance. The decrease in anxiety is a side effect of the decrease of an avoidance. Really important, but very counterintuitive concept. Most people come in and they say, I don't want to be in anxiety. I want to get better so I can do those things that I am avoiding right now. And I always tell them that's like saying, I would love to go to the gym, but I want to get in shape first. Right? It's the active confrontation with the feared situation or emotion that is the active ingredient in the reduction. And again, very counterintuitive. So how do we reduce anxiety? And this is the heart and soul of why you guys are here and why I'm here. There's just basically three things that we do. And I'll be showing a video at the end. It's actually a really funny, kind of scary prank video that kind of elucidates all of this very, very well, but not on purpose. And so the first one is education, is that we really want kids to be able to be a very informed observer of their own experience. A lot of kids have no idea why they're feeling anxious, and they are making wild guesses as to why they're anxious, in the same way that the ancients were making wild guesses as to why the eclipses happened. They didn't know, so they invented stories, and that met their needs, but didn't give them accurate information. And the same thing is true when kids are experiencing the anxiety. Is first of all, they think they're the only ones going through it in most cases. And second of all, they really don't have the ability to be able to understand and narrate for themselves their own experience. I want the kids to become mini experts in understanding their own conditions. And so I do a lot of psychoeducation. And I think anyone who specializes in anxiety does a lot of education, because we're going to be asking kids and their families to face their fears. And that takes not only good, but outstanding communication and outstanding education about why on earth a kid who has an anxiety disorder is going to come in and be told to face their fears and to be in those situations when the anxiety is present in their lives. Second part is cognitive reframing. Our thoughts are the window through which our emotions see the world. And it's a really important thing to understand that the vast majority of anxiety comes not from our events or situations in our lives, but the meaning that we ascribe to them. How we see it, how we appraise it, determines how we're going to experience it. A kid who gets an 88 on a test who thinks that is awful, I'm never going to get into Stanford, is going to have a very different reaction from a kid who's like, I thought I got a C. That's cool. Right? And so again, the 88 didn't produce the experience, the meaning that they gave to it does. What you think it means is what matters. Okay? And so we do a lot of work on that, because tragically we can't stop the alarm from sounding, but we can teach you how to think differently about what it means and what it doesn't mean. The third part is the active ingredients, the behavior change. The behavior change comes first. The research is very clear about that, that when kids are watching themselves do things they didn't think they could do, they are beginning to change the way they think about themselves and their abilities. And so we want that to happen. We want to have kids watch themselves being successful. That's the way self-esteem is increased. The research is very clear about that, that you can't give someone self-esteem. You can give them a chance to build their self-esteem by being successful in their interactions with the world. And when we're talking about anxiety, we're talking about what's called self-efficacy, which means how effective that child or teen thinks he or she can be in dealing with their anxiety when it comes next time. And that is when we know we have these kids, is when they feel like, bring it. You know, you can come and I can beat you. You know, I always tell the kids that it's kind of like you're on a sports team and you've been really practicing for weeks to get ready for your biggest rivals. And you're out in the field getting ready, and then all of a sudden you get news that the other team's bus broke down and they can't make it and they're going to be forfeiting it. Well, you know what? You still get the win, but it won't be very, very satisfying. What's better is if the opponent shows up, plays their best game, and you still win. Then that gives you much more confidence the next time you're in a situation similar to that, that you can do it again. And so we celebrate it when the anxiety shows up. It's game on time. We're prepared for it. We know what to do. You know, it's like when Luke finishes his Jedi training and then can face Darth Vader on equal terms. That's what we're looking for here. So here's an example that I love to give. I think it really illustrates a lot about the power of the way we appraise and think about our own anxiety. So imagine that you're there in the Empire State Building observation deck. It's a beautiful day. You're with some good friends, maybe your family, looking out, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, the fire alarm sounds. And it's this piercing, awful noise. Well, if you're like most people, you're going to be 8, 9, 10 out of 10 level of anxiety. You're going to have a lot of intrusive thoughts about terrorism or fire moving up, and everyone will have the same urge, which is fleeing. How do I get out of that situation? Because an urge to flee is a paramount symptom of a high level of anxiety that we will all experience. Now imagine that same scenario, but a few minutes prior there's an announcement. And they say, this is the superintendent of the building. We're here with the fire marshal. There's been some problems with the system. We'll be testing it shortly. So if it happens to sound, please disregard it. If there's a real emergency, we'll announce it over the loudspeaker. So you shrug your shoulders, you half forget about it, and a few minutes goes by, you're talking to your friends, and then the alarm sounds. You might jump out of your skin because you're not expecting it to go off at that same moment. If you're working in the building, you won't get much work done while it's going off, but you will not have that kicked in the gut urge to flee. And the only difference in those two examples is what you think the alarm means. The thoughts, the appraisal, is the only difference in those examples. And the same thing is true when it's high levels of chronic anxious arousal, panic attacks, intrusive, scary thoughts, whatever it might be, is that when we're in those situations, what we think it means determines our reaction to it. I want the kids to experience their own anxiety from an informed standpoint, from an informed point of view, and to realize that it is a really annoying and irritating false alarm giving you no useful information. And when we get to that place, then the kids really have a different way of experiencing their own anxiety. They're able to be that NYU film student watching the scary movie in class. They're looking at it from an analytical standpoint, from an informed standpoint. They're not the ones eating popcorn and jumping out of their skin when the cat comes out from behind the curtain, right? So that's the perspective I want these kids to have, is that NYU film student watching the scary movie playing in their head and be able to deconstruct it and understand what's going on. The idea that, I make a bumper sticker someday that say, thoughts happen, right? Don't believe everything that you think. They're really important because the one common thread that cuts across every single anxiety disorder is a fancy term called overvalued ideation, which simply means that the kids, or the adults if they're adults, that they believe their thoughts are way more important than they actually are. When people are afraid, they actually aren't afraid of the event because they so rarely interact with their feared event. What they're afraid of is having their thoughts, that they are confusing their thoughts with actual likelihoods. And what we want them to do is, again, to devalue those thoughts, to be a curious observer of them. In the same way when they were younger and blew bubbles out of the little wand, they could watch where the bubbles went, but they wouldn't think of them as threats that have to be popped or changed directions. They can just watch them. And that's the perspective we want from these kids, is to be able to be that informed but curious observer, spectator to their anxiety. I've been talking a lot. Any questions so far? You're asking about genetic vulnerabilities and loading that happens at a very early age, might be biochemical in nature. There is a temperament term called behavioral inhibition, or BI for short. And if we look at kids at a very early age, seeing how inhibited they are to approach a novel stimuli, it is very predictive of long-term levels of anxiety and avoidance. But we also know, the more we're looking at genetic research, that there are genes that express vulnerabilities but then get turned on or off by environmental interactions. So there are many kids who really have a vulnerability for anxiety, and if they're put in the right environmental situation that could trigger that gene to turn on, then it really begins to explode inside of them. And so rather than saying someone is born with an anxiety disorder, I think of it more as they are born with a vulnerability to experience high levels of anxiety. And if they're in the right situation with the right modeling and the right kinds of interactions, then they're likely to develop one over time. But there's no one that's actually, I don't think, born with a guarantee that they won't. I think that anybody could have an anxiety disorder if they were in the right situation and the right kind of conditioning experiences. The question is it correlated with artistic and those kinds of expressive things? I'm not familiar with that research. It certainly is there for things like bipolar disorder. That's very well documented. Tourette's syndrome is highly correlated with being an excellent drummer. I mean, who understands how that works? But they must borrow from the same gene somewhere. But in terms of creativity, in terms of artistic, I can tell you anecdotally that half of the kids that I work with are outstanding athletes, musicians, dancers, artists. It's staggering. I'm jealous of these kids. I have none of that. And they're really good at that. But some kids also try and avoid doing those things because it means that they're being in touch with their experiences more, and they're trying to avoid their own internal emotions. So they're trying to keep kind of their gaze averted from their own emotions, and doing artistic endeavors might actually increase that. Okay. Here's another example. I see lots of younger kids, and one of the fears, believe it or not, that we do see are younger kids, maybe 5 years of age, who are terrified of all things butterflies. And they won't go out to recess because there could be butterflies at recess. Now, if they were stung by a bee when they were 3 and didn't really understand the difference between a bee and a other flying insect, you can see how they would become afraid of all flying insects. So it's not too hard to imagine how a kid could learn to be afraid of butterflies. So when these cute kids come in, I could teach them to become butterfly ninjas, right? I could give them a utility belt with fly swatters and bug spray and send them forth into the recess playground. There's a few things wrong with that. Number one is that they wouldn't have very much fun when they're out there because the entire time they're on the lookout for butterflies, right? And that's no way to have recess. Number two is they would only feel less anxious if they were armed against butterflies. So if they forget their utility belt at home, their anxiety goes back to baseline. And number three, and most importantly, they never learn that butterflies can't hurt them. Okay? And so when people are trying to avoid anxiety, when they're trying to say, I can't because I'm anxious, or I'll be anxious if I do that, I always tell them, stop swatting the butterflies. I want to land on your nose so you can see it long enough to realize it's not a threat to you. That the only threat anxiety really has over us is avoiding us and constricting our lives. Right? We don't want to avoid to cope with it. And so paradoxically, we don't avoid anxiety. When we deal with anxiety, I tell the kids all the time, if you're out in the ocean and you're having a great time and you're chest deep in water, and a big wave starts to curl in towards shore and you get really scared because you're a little kid, your instincts tell you to run back to shore, right? But what happens if you try and do that? The wave's faster than you. It's going to catch you from behind and swamp you. The best thing to do is the most counterintuitive of all things. It's to dive into the wave, right? And if you avoid the wave, you're going to end up getting hurt. If you dive into the wave, it takes courage to do it, especially the first time. We've all done it, right? That first time, we're all scared to jump into the wave. But when we come out the other side, we have a new knowledge that we can do that again next time, and that the wave actually is not that thick. And if I dive through it, I will, in fact, come out the other side. So let's talk more about anxiety disorders for a minute, because I say it's the Baskin-Robbins of mental disorders because there are so many different disorders that exist under the rubric of this. Now, OCD in the bottom I put an asterisk with because in our new book of disorders, it's now under its own heading. So it's no longer an anxiety disorder, but it certainly is related to anxiety, and we see it all the time. And so what's really important to understand is that there are many, many ways to have anxiety, and it's really important to know which one the kid is experiencing, because if someone walks in with social phobia, the treatment is very different from panic disorder. And one of the things that drives me crazy is when I get a call doing an intake and some great parent says, I really need you to help my son or my daughter, and I say, okay, what's wrong? What do they have? And they say, anxiety. And I'll say, well, so do I. Every living person has anxiety. What's their diagnosis? And they say, just anxiety. And they say they've seen somebody for a couple of years and they just said they have anxiety. Because what kind of brand you have will directly influence the treatment that's designed to be effective for those kids. And so it's really important that we all understand that anxiety comes in a lot of different ways. And by the way, even knowing what disorder category they fall into only gives us a very small bit of the information. And here's why. A panic attack is related to any anxiety disorder. It's not even a disorder itself. It's simply an experience. But you only need 4 out of 12 symptoms to meet the criteria for it. And so there are literally almost 4,000 ways to have an anxiety disorder. I mean, to have a panic attack, right? And I've seen many thousands of kids over my career. I've never seen the same one panic in the same way. And so it's really important, and this really confounds teachers and parents, is that I don't get it. How is it that he or she can do this, but then that thing that seems so similar is just off the table? They can't do it at all. Why can this kid go to prom and do all of these activities and be a pom-pom in front of a big audience, but they can't give a class presentation in front of 16 kids? How is that possible, right? And so it's really important to understand that there is a lot of different ways that these disorders can exhibit itself. And even separation anxiety disorder, that's probably the best example of it, is that there are so many different and important variations in that disorder that simply knowing that diagnosis doesn't tell us very much about it. We need to know the dimensions. We need to know the phenomenology, the kid's experience of anxiety is very, very important. And again, that we might see behavior that seems incongruent. I had a woman who came to see me years ago as a present to herself, and she would give talks in front of many hundreds of people each week, but she could not talk in front of 4 or 5 in a small gathering where you go around and say, hi, my name is situation. And so she was at risk for losing her job because she was always late for meetings, trying to avoid that first few minutes of introductions. And so, how does that make sense, that you can talk in front of hundreds of people, but you can't do it in front of 4 or 5? And the answer is, if it made sense, it wouldn't be a disorder, right? If it made sense, then it would be anxiety, right? If you're afraid of petting cobras, that's a really good fear to have, right? I would encourage you to keep that fear. But when it's in a situation where it doesn't make sense, that's when it becomes disordered. The other part of it is that, remember I was saying before that avoidance comes in a lot of different flavors. One of the ways it comes in is what's called safety behaviors. What safety behaviors are is if you can't escape a situation or an environment that makes you anxious, you will, almost assuredly, seek out a way to feel less anxious in that situation, whether it's by distracting yourself, whether it's by having a Lucky Charm in your pocket or being with someone that you care about, a spouse or a parent if you're a kid. Those are all safety behaviors, and they interfere with the process of getting rid of the anxiety. They're one of the things that we try and eliminate very quickly and early on in treatment, and here's the reason why. If you are trying to be a ocean rescue swimmer, and they're trying to teach you cold water survival, and they're trying to get your body used to being in cold water quickly so you can go in and rescue somebody right away when you're already dry in cold water. And so having you enter into the cold water and allow yourself to be cold, using a safety behavior is like wearing a wetsuit. You will feel less uncomfortable in that moment, but you will not be building skills to tolerate that situation in the future. Safety behaviors are wetsuits. And so we want to take those away. I've treated many people. I had a guy years ago who was afraid to fly, and the only difference was he flew all the time. And so you'd think that would get rid of his anxiety all by itself, but it didn't. So I knew he was doing safety behaviors, and sure enough, he had a whole litany of things that he would do. He was a very smart guy, so he would go through very sophisticated safety behaviors of only flying at certain times of day and certain upper level disturbances and all kinds of stuff he would research. And he wouldn't drink or eat, he wouldn't go to the bathroom on the plane, so it limited his range really severely. And so I knew that what we had to do was just strip away the safety behaviors one at a time. Because he flew so often, we could do that, and sure enough, very early on, he flew to Beijing. And we weren't doing anything different except that we were not doing safety behaviors. So safety behaviors are same in line with the avoidance. There's avoidance by a different name. Other thing is that just like a tornado can demolish one house but leave the house next to it standing untouched, that's the way these things can be for kids. It's very typical for kids that I work with to be in drama and to be on stage in front of many, many hundreds of people. But they have social phobia, and the parents say, I don't get it. I just don't get it. She can sing in front of 1,000 people, but she can't go to a party with 10 friends. I don't get it. Right? And the idea for that disorder is that when you're on stage, you aren't being yourself, you're playing a role. So you're not going to be judged for being weird or for being boring because you're not doing it on your own. You are just playing a part, so you're not going to be vulnerable for that. But if you're at a party and you say you do the wrong thing, then people might think that you're weird. I had a kid once with social anxiety say to him, life had become like he was at a costume party he wasn't invited to. And he was terrified to say or do the wrong thing to reveal himself to be an imposter. And so he didn't want to go to unstructured circumstances like school lunches, parties, Boy Scouts, anything like that. But he could certainly go on stage and sing his heart out and to do all kinds of things in front of an audience as long as it wasn't him who was deciding what to do, as long as he was being told what to do. And that's why teachers and parents often are very confused by how can you do this and not that? And how do you separate oppositionality and defiance from anxiety-based avoidance? Right? It's a really hard thing to sometimes call, even for professionals. Let's talk about how anxiety affects the learning process, because we're at the lab school, so we should talk about learning. Does everyone know what working memory is? If I ask you for your number and you give it to me, that's your long-term memory. If I give you mine and ask you to repeat it back 2 minutes later, that's short-term memory. If I ask you for your phone number backwards, that's working memory. It's being able to hold and manipulate information in your head. And it is the one that is most vulnerable to anxiety-based interference, which makes sense. Working memory is also highly predictive of performance in standardized tests and all kinds of different things. And so it's almost like having a RAM in your computer taken up by a bunch of useless programs running in the background. And it's going to slow down the main one that you want to use. And the same thing is true when it comes to these kinds of situations, is that you're having all of this competition for a very limited working memory capacity. It's like having a heckler when you try and take a test. How annoying would that be? It'd be really hard to divide your attention appropriately. Other part is that threat cues are always prioritized. They are what our biology tells us to be on the lookout for the most. And what that means is if I told you guys, by the way, I don't mean to tell you this, but I lost a rattlesnake before you guys walked in, but it hates people. Don't worry about it. I'm sure it won't be a problem. But please look at me, right? No one could do that because your biology is telling you to be threat aware and be looking primarily for what could present a danger to you. These are all words. This next slide will really sum up exactly what this experience is like for a lot of these kids. Okay. Imagine that you're there over the gorge, you're next in line to go bungee jumping, and someone's trying to teach you about conjugation of verbs or calculus, right? Who among us could possibly do that or process information? And for a lot of my kids, this is the way it is when they're in school, is that they are so much aware of the threats in their environment or internally if they have panic disorder or OCD even. And so we're asking them to do that while learning. And for a lot of kids, that's a very, very difficult task to do, and it is universally exhausting to go through. And that's when I talk to kids and I'll say, I'm giving all these talks, what do you think that people should know that they don't about what it's like to live with one of these disorders? And they always say how exhausted we always are. You know, how you go to a funeral sometimes, you don't do anything physically exerting, but at the end of the day, you are just spent, you have nothing in your reserves. That's the way a lot of these kids feel every day. Is that having an anxiety disorder is like having a second full-time job. And it's literally exhausting for these kids. Then a lot of them don't want to sleep at night. And the reason I hear a lot from these kids is that if they try all day to be distracted, to keep their mind busy, because if you give an anxious mind time and space, it will fill it with anxious thoughts and feelings. And these kids are afraid to lay down in bed for that few minutes before they fall asleep. They're terrified of that gap. So what they will do is they will stay awake until they are so exhausted that they know as soon as their head hits the pillow, they're going to fall asleep. Then the next day, they're even more exhausted, which increases their anxiety, and it gets in a very nasty feedback loop. Okay? Perfectionism is something that we see a lot of in what we do. So we are big fans of appropriately high standards, as is lab school. We want kids to achieve and believe in themselves. It's an important thing. But perfectionism is something very different because it's unobtainable. It interferes with performance. And it's also a risk factor for things like eating disorders, depression, and tragically even for suicide. And many, many kids that I work with, especially, I call it the Montgomery County Syndrome, perfectionism. I don't say it lightly, believe me. And so when we see these kids, they often confuse their first name with their GPA and their last name with their SAT scores. They believe that if they live a life that looks great on paper, that it's a good life. And we know that many of those really great paper lives don't live very well. And so perfectionists forget that. And so what we also know is that those kids tend to actually do okay in low stress environments. When there aren't that many things that are competing for their attention, they can handle it. When they have a few plates spinning, they can do okay with it. But as soon as they get to a higher stress environment, everything comes crashing down. So the problem is they get reinforced at an early age for being perfectionistic when they can pull it off. And then they can't, and it's often in middle school, 7th grade especially, when they suddenly can't keep up with the work in the same fashion they would before. And now I don't know how to not be perfect because it's part of who I thought that I was. And if I am not seen as a smart kid, it's a threat to my sense of who I am. It's not simply an inconvenience, it's a mortal threat for a lot of these kids, or that's the way they experience it. So one of the things that we do is we talk about optimalism. So I was watching one of those really bad survival shows on TV, maybe a year ago or so. So there was this guy, Survivor Man, of course, is his name, and he was stranded in some frozen tundra somewhere. And he was given a piece of seal meat and a broken snowmobile and said, survive for a week with no one else around. So he's tape recording himself with no makeup on. And he's there, and he's building this world's ugliest igloo. And it's kind of like the one there on the left. And he's moving very deliberately, very laboriously. You're right, I'm sorry. My left, you're right. The other one. And so he's doing this thing, and he comes to the camera afterwards and says, I actually could build a really good igloo. I was trained in that because of course he had been. And he said, but I don't want to do that because in order to build that really great igloo like the one on your left there, before it gets dark out, I'm going to need to have to expend a lot of calories and burn a lot of that, and I will get sweaty. And if I get sweaty and wet and then climb into this igloo in this frozen tundra, I will die tonight. So in that situation, the perfect igloo can kill you. What we want is the optimal igloo. What is the one that is the best for that circumstance? And so we really want kids to learn what optimalism is and what it means, that B+ students are not miserable people. I see way more all A students in my practice than I see B students. Believe me. I see plenty of Ivy League kids as well. So when we talk about optimalism, we talk about what is the best or most effective. We also want to dispel this awful illusion that somehow success and failure are on opposing different courses. Success and failure, I always tell the kids, they hold hands and walk down the same path. It's not failure or success. It is failure, 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 success. Failure is feedback, and that's all it is and all it ever will be. And if you fear failure, then you're not going to walk down the same path where success is anyway. Because again, they're holding hands. In the same way that pain and progress hold hands and walk down the same path. They're not in any way exclusive of each other. We want kids to understand that there's a natural variation, that half of everything you do will be below your average doing that thing, by definition, right? And so you want to teach kids about natural variations in all organisms and all things that are natural. And so if you are a batter and you're not batting as well as you did last month, it doesn't mean you got worse. There's a natural variability that happens in those situations. Balance is our goal. You know, the middle path, someone very smart years ago called it that. And I think that if we have balance being our expectation and our goal, it's a very different model. We have 24 poker chips in front of us every single day. And if we put a whole bunch in one pile, they're coming from somewhere else. No one's given bonus of these chips. It depends on where you allocate them, but everyone has the same number. And so if you're putting a whole lot into one category, the question is, where are they not going? And perfectionists tend to live very unbalanced lives as a consequence of that. We also want kids to understand that flexibility is strength. Oak trees make great furniture. And in light wind, they do fantastic. But they only know of two ways to be, vertical or horizontal, right? They don't bend. Whereas the palm trees know that they can allow the wind to blow. They don't fight against the wind because they know they can outlast the wind. So when I work with these kids who are often very rigid, because rigidity is a petri dish for depression and anxiety to grow on, is we teach them that they want to do palm tree thinking. We want to deal with the anxiety in the same way a palm tree deals with the wind. It allows it to be there, and then it outlasts it. When you fight against it like the oak tree, that's when things go wrong. We also want to understand from the kid's point of view that if you are that guy and you are in a flood and you're holding on to a branch just above the torrent of water and you've been white-knuckling it for hours, and the guy in the Coast Guard bucket comes down from the helicopter and reaches out to you, you know he or she is there to save you, and probably the only person that can, but man, it takes a lot of courage to loosen your grip. And every kid that I work with who has an anxiety disorder, bar none, has some level of ambivalence about getting better. Because to them, they feel like the anxiety is somehow protective of them. That by worrying about things, I can be on guard against them and I can make sure that I'm prepared for whatever might happen. We know that anxiety is, when it's a disorder, is no longer productive and it's no longer keeping you safe or even informed. It's a false alarm giving you no useful or actionable information. So we want them to really understand that, but it's important that we also expect the ambivalence to be there. That a lot of kids feel like there's this pendulum swing. That if I don't get all A's, I'm going to fail out and be homeless. Or if I don't constantly look on guard, my mom's driving in her car for threats that might be around there, she won't see one and she'll crash. I have a lot of kids who've been in car accidents and they are driving in the front seat like this, looking around constantly for things that might be of danger to them because they have the illusion that's protective. Or people that have had panic disorder and they're taking their pulse while they are in a movie theater to see what their pulse rate is. That's not protective. There's nothing about that that's going to help you to not have any kind of a cardiac event, but it might give you the illusion that what you're doing is reducing your anxiety. Okay. One of the big questions that comes up a lot is between accommodating and enabling, because we know that avoidance is the lifeblood of the disorder, but sometimes kids aren't ready to face that certain level of their hierarchy yet in terms of where they are. So how do we tell that difference between accommodating a real disorder and enabling avoidance to be present? And it's a really hard line, and it's a very individualized question that's impossible for me to answer in a generic sense, because each kid is very different. Even through the course of treatment, that answer is different. So if I have a kid who's terrified of giving class presentations, and I've seen kids that were hospitalized because they were suicidal about giving presentations, literally. I don't want them to be told they have to give a presentation, right? That's an appropriate accommodation to postpone those or to do it in an alternative setting. But if kids are really saying, I don't want to do that, I don't know what to do, and everyone says, okay, you don't have to, now they're being reinforced for exhibiting anxiety because they're getting opportunities removed from them that are scary. And so that is a very, very strongly reinforced behavior because they're getting to escape or avoid something they're uncomfortable with, and then they are limiting their ability to get feedback from the environment about that situation. Okay, so when this comes up, it's the question. And it's the hardest one to answer, but it's a great way to kind of frame this discussion when you're talking to your patients or your kids is, to what end? What is this accommodation going to produce? Let me go back to that. Is this moving towards a larger goal, or is this a way to circumvent the request to face their fear? I care much more about the direction of travel than the speed of transit. And so if we're moving in the direction of confronting anxiety, that's wonderful, and that's what we want to do. But parents, and Wendy Silverman, who's a great child psychologist and a researcher, came up with this idea called a protection trap, right? That parents try and help their kids avoid anxiety. It's what good parents do, right? The same way you wouldn't want your kid to be injured playing a sport, you don't want them to experience anxiety when they're living their lives. And so a lot of really great parents will try and help their kids to not experience anxiety, which again, the motivation is pure. It's a great idea in theory, but what happens is the parents become complicit with the avoidance. We want the parents to be able to separate in their mind their child from their anxiety disorder. The child is welcomed and loved at all times. The anxiety disorder is neither. And we don't want to give the anxiety what it's looking for, or it's going to stick around for a really long time. Now, we also know that many, many parents of kids with anxiety disorders experience their own anxiety, which means that they are very vulnerable, because nothing hurts more than seeing your kids suffer. And it's very tempting to then go to bat for them and to help them to feel less anxious by eliminating requests or by giving them really over-accommodation, is a term we use for it. And that it feels great for the parent. They can soothe their kids, right? But then both parties, the parent and the kid, get reinforced for that interaction. The kids learn that by acting in an anxious way, I get to escape or avoid aversive things, and I get access to really high quality attention from my parents, right? The parents learn that if I give reinforcement in the form of reassurance or in proximity or back rubs or whatever it might be, then I don't have to see my kid act anxious anymore. Again, both parties being reinforced for the same problem behavior. So there are 3 ways that we can reduce problem behaviors, including anxiety. And when I talk about behavior, it's really important to understand that we are not trying to get kids to suffer in silence. We would never do that. But we know that when kids are acting in an anxious way, any subjective experience is increased by focused attention on it. If you have a backache and I tell you to write a paragraph about the exquisite nature of your back pain, you will experience more of it than you do if you write a story about the game last night. And so we could punish it, doesn't work, wouldn't be fair. So we don't use punishment. Extinction means we figure out what is the purpose or the function of that behavior, and how do we turn off that spigot of reinforcement they're getting, whether it's avoidance-based, having removal of requirements or expectations, or if it's access to desirable things like attention or tangible rewards. If we can figure out what the function of the behavior is and we can stop that from paying off, that is extinction, and is a necessary but rarely sufficient by itself way of doing it. The best and most important thing that any parent can do to help a kid experience less anxiety is what's called differential reinforcement. Let me tell you what that means, okay? is if a kid like this dog is saying, I want some reassurance, I really want something that you have, I want you to tell me it's going to be okay, or I want you to cope for me, whatever it might be, what you're going to see is it's like a dog begging for steak at the table. And you say, all right, fine, here's your steak, now go away and never come back. Right? I have 2 dogs. That never works for me when I try and do it. And so the same thing is true with anxiety. If you give the anxiety what you want and say, now go away, now it's learned it can get it again. It's going to keep back. And like the begging dog, the actual incidence and intensity of that behavior will increase, not decrease in the future. And so what do we do? Let me move forward here for a minute. So number 1 is that we model what we want the kids to experience. So if you are terrified to fly, you win a trip to Spain, and you suck it up over the Atlantic Ocean, and you hit a really rough turbulence patch, and you're bouncing around. One example is the flight attendant saying, everybody, remain calm. We're going to make it. The wings are very firmly attached. I promise it's going to be fine. That's example 1. Example 2 is the same person saying, do you want tea or coffee with your lunch, ma'am? One is offering reassurance, which actually validates the need to ask for it and strengthens the anxiety over time. The other one is modeling non-anxious arousal is a much more powerful, because modeling is always more powerful than words. So I have parents that I've seen 5, 6 years ago, and they come back in for a booster, and they say, we're still tea or coffeeing it when our kid acts anxious. So it's a really important takeaway, is to model the non-anxious arousal, especially in the presence of the kid's kind of anxious activation. But also, and this goes back to the differential reinforcement, is that imagine that you have bought a new house and there's a great flower bed out in front, and it's overrun with weeds though, and you try and pull the weeds out, and they look kind of like that, and they are prickly and deeply rooted, and you can't get them out of the ground. One of the things that you could do is you could plant the flower seeds anyway, and you could selectively water, give sunlight and nutrients to those seeds, and deny those very same things to the weeds. It's not going to happen overnight, but if you repeat that process of watering the seeds and not the weeds, over time, the weeds will wither and die, and the flowers will grow. That is what we do with these kids. Is there any behavior we want to see more of, we attend to with reinforcement and specific praise. Behavior we want to see less of, we try and ignore to the best of our ability. Water the seeds, not the weeds. Parents often say, what do I do when they're anxious? I say, that's the wrong question. The right question is, what do you do when they're not? How do you catch them in a good coping system? How do you catch them coping effectively and having low levels of anxiety? And how do you reinforce that? Because you can grow that like the seeds by giving consistent reinforcement to that. Okay, let me go to a video, and then we'll take questions, okay? This video is from the movie about Ray Charles. Those of you who haven't seen the movie, he was not born blind. He lost his vision as a young boy, and this is a very powerful scene, so I'll warn you to get your tissues ready if you need them. This is a flashback of when he is almost all the way blind. He can only see very, very small amounts of color, and he is chasing his new pet cricket into the little shanty he's being raised at. Okay.
I hear you too, Mama. You're right there.
Yes, I am.
Why are you crying, Mama?
'Cause I'm happy.
What she was doing is the hardest thing that she could do, which is to resist that very strong temptation to go over and hug poor Ray and tell him it's going to be okay and coddle him and make him feel temporarily better. And you can see she's a great actress. You can see that urgency that she feels within her as any good parent would have. And she does the hardest of all things, which is to not follow through with that urge. And what does Ray do? The only thing Ray can do is he gets up, brushes himself off, and finds alternative ways of coping. When kids are experiencing anxiety, we want parents to say to them things like, what can you tell yourself when you feel this way? It makes you less reinforcing as an object, and it helps the kids to look internally for their coping system. And the more that we pair that internal look for the coping and pair that with the anxious arousal, we turn that classical conditioning in our favor. The presence of anxiety becomes peanut butter, and the coping self-statements become the jelly. That when you experience the anxious arousal, then the coping skills come because they've been conditioned to appear in that same way. Okay, on that sheet somewhere are some examples of coping card things that you can tell yourself, things like, just because I'm scared doesn't mean I can't do it, I'm stronger than my fear. All those kinds of things are really important for kids to understand. And what that means, and if you look at those, they're not things about why you shouldn't be afraid. They're reasons that you can be afraid and take that anxiety with you along your journey. Right? That the idea that I can't because I'm anxious are two different things. Right? We can do things and be anxious. It's a dialectic. It is not in any way a dichotomous split that we can only do one of those things. That we are designed as people to do things when we're tired and hungry, thirsty, anxious. The avoidance, again, is what leads to ultimately to the high levels of distress. Okay, so I wish I talked to you for hours. I have so many things that I want to teach you guys, but I would love to answer questions that you guys might have. Yes? So the question is about medication for things like comorbid anxiety and ADHD. When it comes to ADHD, the medication is a frontline treatment. That as a behaviorist makes me pain to say that, but the research is very clear that getting kids on right meds can change lives. And I am a firm proponent in the majority of cases of kids with impairing levels of ADHD being on meds. When it comes to anxiety disorders, there was a great research published a few years ago, actually on Halloween, and they looked at sertraline and CBT, what I do, and they found that sertraline, which is Zoloft, by the way, combined with exposure-based therapy was the most effective outcome. When I talked to the researchers and said, why'd you guys choose sertraline? They said, we got it for free. So there certainly is some evidence to say that a combination of the two can be very, very effective. My bias, if someone comes in and they're not on meds for anxiety, let's try and do 12 weeks of really high quality exposure-based CBT, see where we are. If the kids are not getting better, or they're not able to engage in the exposure therapy because the anxiety is so high they can't get in the door, which I see a lot. I do a lot of home sessions. I do a lot of parking lot sessions for kids who can't get in, or there's just marked suffering and impairment that we just can't tolerate even for 12 weeks, then we can do meds. But I see very impaired kids, and the vast majority of the kids I work with are on meds before I ever see them at all. It's a great question. Yes? So the question is about kids with allergies have a real reason to be afraid of an allergic reaction. I see a lot of those kids too, by the way. And if they were going to be doing safety behaviors, like wiping things down, where do we know where that becomes a safety behavior and when does it become an accommodation? It's a good example. In that situation, the one that you described, it is absolutely appropriate. That's part of the hierarchy, is that for the kids with allergies that we see, we'll do exposure in our session where we will bring in things that we get a clearance from the allergy doctor that it's okay, and we will have them eventually begin doing things like eating something that we know doesn't have the thing they're allergic to in it, but they still feel a great deal of anxiety because they can't tell for sure about it. But in terms of homework or doing things at school, I think it's very appropriate to say at first we're going to do it with washing it down as the first ladder, the first step on our ladder. The next one will be only wiping down like a square foot. The next thing will be only wiping down a little bit, and then from there we're going to be eating on an elevated little plate, and then eventually making it just be very normative in that way. So as long as it's part of a plan that is seeking confrontation with the anxiety, it's great. And so that's kind of like getting your toes in and then your ankle in, and you don't have to do a cannonball off the high dive when the water's cold. You can move in gradually. And that's a very good example of how that can happen. Tragically, I only usually get calls about kids who are actively suffering from anxiety. I don't get calls yet from parents who think their kids are vulnerable for experiencing anxiety. I can't wait for that. Those are the ones that are great because we can arm them with these very specific skills about ways to think differently, to be telling yourself that right now in this moment I'm having a scary thought, right? That no one in the history of the world has ever had a fatal thought or a lethal idea, right? To teach those kids those things is a very, very important thing. And the research is just emerging now on that prevention, but it is staggering how effective it can be. So hopefully over time, more and more people will call up, but even beyond that, hopefully this gets intertwined with a curriculum at some point. At an early age, kids understand how to manage their own levels of intense anxiety or just emotional arousal, period. I didn't bring into this one, but there is a whole list of normative fears, like different kids at different ages fear the dark, fear strangers, fear loud noises. You have a 10-year-old watching a scary YouTube video and they're going to have nightmares. I know that from last night. That was fun. And so those things are very normative. When you're looking for it, what you want to look for is avoidance, functional impairment. Remember, anxiety itself is appropriate in a lot of circumstances. What we're looking for is, are they restricting their life because of the anxiety? That's the biggest marker, is functional impairment. But err on the side of getting a consult if you're not sure. Great questions in there. One is teenagers with social anxiety. My great passion is working with kids with social anxiety. 8% of all teens are going to have it. If someone in their family has it, jump to 13%. So it's a very common thing. What social phobia is an allergic reaction to being judged or embarrassed, basically what it comes down to. And so it can be chronic. 85% of kids who experience it say it gets in the way of their education. 91% say it does for their career down the road. It limits people's ability to make and keep friends over time. It restricts them from having great social connections. And the perceived social support is vitamin C against depression. So there's a high level of comorbidity between social anxiety and depression because it restricts their ability to access that social support. Depression. I had a kid give me the best definition of depression I've ever heard. This is going back about 10 years. I still remember it very well. He was 12. And he said that for me, he had depression, that life had become like a stick of chewing gum that lost its flavor, right? That I could keep chewing, but why would I want to? It's just, the opposite of depression is not happiness, it's vitality, right? And so that's a really important thing to understand. And with teens and younger kids, you don't even need to be sad to have depression. Irritability can take its place. And depression and anxiety obviously are kissing cousins, and they share a lot of symptoms and a lot of overlap. And kids who are very anxious and are living a very constricted life in a little cocoon, having a depressed reaction is not that hard to imagine because you're getting less of that positive reinforcement from your environment because you are not engaging in those activities. Okay? Yes, sir. Yes, I do. And I think that part of it is that kids now, there is just 24/7 being on, right? It's harder to find space and time to relax. I encourage mindfulness-based meditation, as I know that Bill Stuckster had talked about last time he was here, that research shows it to be very powerful as a way to modulate stress over time. But yes, absolutely, I think that it's rising. And I just by the calls that I get, I can tell you that. It's incredible how often people call up, and when they do, they're often desperate for services because there's such a need, and the kids are suffering so immensely. I haven't found the regional data on that. I can tell you, though, that it's different in Bethesda than it is in Boise. And that a lot of these kids really are kind of caught up in a current where you're expected to incorporate your self-esteem or your self-worth into your performance academically or athletically. So yes, I think that in this area and specifically, the high pressure, high successful families, I think that even though they don't mean to, there's an implied expectation. If mom went to Yale, dad went to Harvard, and I'm not doing so great. They say it's fine, but I don't feel like I belong with them, and that's going to produce a lot of anxiety for a lot of these kids. So I think it's absolutely geographically based. Great question. How do we teach kids mindfulness meditation? YouTube is a great resource. There's all kinds of examples of mindfulness for kids on YouTube, and kids are so hooked into media these days, it's a natural thing for them. So I would look into those. When I gave a talk at Sidwell, I played one of those for teens so they could hear other teens talking about the values and virtues of it. When I talk to kids about it, I'm just saying basically, we want your brain to be thinking about what your body is doing. Is basically that congruence between mind and body is what mindfulness is about. We call it the opposite of forgetfulness. And so teaching kids how to unitask, the lost art of unitasking, is a really important thing. Okay. I know we have about maybe time for one or two more questions. Yes. I see it all. I saw 2 kids today who have that issue. It's actually not that different. We want to turn the blisters into calluses, sometimes literally. And so we can learn to tolerate things like the noise of the AC unit. We don't notice it after a while being on. We can habituate to things if we're doing it consistently. If you go to Niagara Falls, even though there's billions of gallons, we can get used to it very quickly. If you go to your hotel room near the falls and the faucet is dripping, it'll drive you crazy because it's intermittent. So if you can't turn the faucet off, you try and try and try and you can't get it off, you could turn it up and then you can go to sleep. Right? And so that's what we do when kids have sensory issues or anxiety. We turn up the thing we can't turn off, and they can habituate to it. Yeah, so what happens is that agitation and anxiety are different experiences, and physiologically speaking, you have someone to a polygraph, you cannot tell the difference between someone who's really excited and having a panic attack, because physiologically they're the same thing. And so if there isn't that emotional valence tied to it, then it's fine. But doesn't mean that you can't teach them skills of kind of grounding and self-soothing, or using fidgets, doing things like that. Some schools have kids sit on yoga balls during class so that they can get some movement in while they are doing a math problem because their body wants to be in motion. And the more that you're trying to do one thing, the more you can't do the other. If you ever see Michael Jordan, he always had his tongue out, when he was doing things. A lot of younger kids have that same experience where they're focusing on one thing, their body does something totally different. And so giving them an outlet for that, a way to kind of get the wiggles out for younger kids can be really appropriate. Okay, so I know that we're out of time. If people want to linger and talk, I can do it for a little bit. But thank you guys so much for coming here.